So thank you all for your patience as we've gotten started. And to those just joining us, my name is Katie Fleming. I'm the Gallery Manager and Education Coordinator at the Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. And I'm thrilled to welcome you all here today and to present today's program, Cultural Representation and the Guadalupe Address in Heavenly Bodies. I'm also thrilled to introduce our speakers, Sofia Howard and Maureen Miller. Hi, Sofia and Maureen. Sofia is a second-year undergraduate student at UC Berkeley, where she's pursuing a degree in political economy and computer science. Maureen Miller is a historian of medieval Europe with a particular interest in Italy. And in the fall of 2019, which now seems like a million years ago, Professor Miller taught a course inviting students to examine the blockbuster 2018 exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art entitled Heavenly Bodies. Today, Sofia Howard, a student in the course, will be presenting findings from her research, which critically explores the curatorial interpretation of a particular dress in the exhibit, which you may have gotten hints of in the event description for today. And her presentation will be followed by a moderated conversation with both Sofia and Maureen and myself, and during which I invite you all to pose questions to both of them. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sofia to present her work today. So Sofia Jimenez-Howard, thank you so much.
Hi, yeah, my name is Sofia. Thank you so much for coming. So I'm going to be presenting the research I did for last fall for that class under Professor Miller, and it discussed the 2018 Heavenly Bodies exhibit. So let me just pull up my slideshow right now. Okay. Okay, so for those who don't know, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York is one of the world's largest art museums, featuring approximately 2.2 million works in its permanent collections and visited by nearly 7 million people in 2018 alone. The Heavenly Bodies exhibit was the most attended exhibit of all time and featured haute couture and ready-to-wear designer gowns whose inspiration varied from priest vestments to nun habits to angels to Joan of Arc, with each gown picked by the curators at the museum for their relationship with this idea of a Catholic imagination. So I decided to focus my research on this gown, a Christian Lacroix wedding dress from his fall-winter 2009-2010 collection. So Christian Lacroix was born in France and spent a majority of his childhood sketching historical and fashion costumes. This passion for history and fashion led him to pursue a career as a museum curator, and he actually met his wife while studying museum studies at the École du Louvre. However, he ultimately ended up opening a haute couture house in 1987 and thus started the path to becoming a world-renowned fashion designer, utilizing crosses and other religious symbols in a wide variety of his designs. So while Lacroix has yet to state that he affirms the Catholic faith, he has repeatedly described the importance of religion in his life and his craft. The prevalence of religious iconography in his designs can be found throughout his years as an active designer, with bedazzled crosses, such as the one seen on the slide here, actually graced Anna Wintour's first cover of Vogue magazine in 1988. And those crosses are some of his most popular embellishments. So this blend of Lacroix's fascination with religion, French history, and costume design has resulted in Christian Lacroix's distinct design style, as the garment I chose from this exhibit incorporates elements of theatrical Catholicism with traditional French court fabric choices. So I'm going to get a little bit into Catholicism for those who may be unfamiliar with the religion. And so Catholicism, while it is a unified religion with fairly consistent beliefs across the globe, always takes on a slightly different flavor depending on the environment in which it's being practiced. So the Virgin Mary is an interesting symbol, as she has seemed to adapt to the specific needs of various geographical communities and thus morphed into various representations of the same person. So while the iconography for Jesus, for example, is rather consistent across all Catholic cultures, Mary is often stylized very differently across various countries and even within certain regions of that country. And part of this phenomenon is due to this idea of a Marian apparition, which is a reported supernatural appearance of the mother of Jesus as an expression of Mary's motherly care for the church. These apparitions have occurred across the globe, and it is believed that each apparition is sent to draw attention to the needs of a particular time and place. thus creating varying interpretations of Mary to fit the unique culture that Catholicism is existing within. So, although there are many reported sightings and many widely accepted stories, the Pope and the Holy See have only specifically verified 11 of these reported apparitions, with 2 of them occurring in Belgium, 1 in Portugal, 1 in Brazil, 1 in Mexico, and 6 in France. So, as you can see here, this gown is the only entirely white religious piece in the fall 2009 haute couture collection. And when it appeared as the final garment during the runway show, it produced an apparition-like effect because it presented a sharp contrast to the dark colors of the other garments. The audience actually gave this garment a standing ovation once it appeared, and during the final presentation of the collection, Christian Lacroix walked out arm in arm with the model wearing the Virgin Mary dress. And another interesting thing that I discovered in my research is that this show, the Fall/Winter 2009-2010 collection, was actually Christian Lacroix's last haute couture show. And the somber mood and dark color palette was intentional, with the aims of turning the show into a sort of funeral for the death of the house. However, this symbolic burial was actually meant to symbolize a sort of rebirth as well. And thus, at least for me, it became increasingly clear that his opulent wedding dress could also potentially serve as a light at the end of the tunnel and a sort of religious hope that some saint, who I argue is Guadalupe or some Marian apparition, will be looking over him and his house in the future. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, this gown appears to be most representative of the Mexican apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe, as opposed to other interpretations of the Virgin, due to the stylization of the ovular headdress, the organdy roses, and Spanish influence on the embroidery and tulle sleeve ruffles. A unique characteristic of Our Lady of Guadalupe is her signature mandorla, which radiates not just from her head in like the typical depiction of a halo, but surrounding her entire body in an oval shape that I believe mirrors the large headdress on the garment. And while the Miracle of Roses appears in several stories of different apparitions, this particular miracle is essential to the story of the native boy Diego and Guadalupe, as the shroud or tilma, which I actually have pictured here on the slide, Diego fills with foreign Castilian roses per Guadalupe's request, produces a life-size image of Guadalupe that convinces the community to carry out God's will. Thus, the multicolored organdy roses that decorate the gown seem to be most reflective of both traditional Mexican colored rose designs and the Miracle of Roses that appeared in the apparition of the Lady of Guadalupe. The Spanish-inspired embroidery patterns found throughout the garment are also found in other Lacroix designs as well. And these 3 characteristics of the gown, in my opinion, lead to the conclusion that Lacroix, rather than just drawing on his own native French culture for the design, utilized many aspects of the iconography of Our Lady of Guadalupe to create his Marian apparition garment. And all of the artifacts you can see on the slide here are actually part of the Hearst Museum's archives. And as you can see in the pictures, they're all artifacts from Latin America. 4 of these are statues or paintings of Guadalupe, and the dress in the bottom left is stylized with traditional Mexican color rose designs that, in my opinion, as I mentioned earlier, bear strong resemblance to the organdy roses on the dress. And while this gown presents a non-European depiction of the Catholic imagination, Christian Lacroix himself is European, and this gown is arguably the only gown in the entire exhibit that demonstrates an obvious connection to non-European Catholic cultures. In fact, every designer featured in the exhibit, with the exception of Japanese Jun Takahashi and French but Tunisian-born Azzedine Alea, is European. And contrary to what the diversity of designers represented in the exhibit may suggest, Catholicism spread and grew in many non-European countries and cultures due to religious colonialism. Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, the Philippines, and the Democratic Republic of Congo are all majority Catholic nations that fall under the top 10 countries with the largest Roman Catholic populations. And each of these countries have developed their own distinct Catholic culture due to the adaptation of the religion among the colonized peoples. And thus each have a unique depiction of the Catholic imagination. So then I wonder, like, what or who is responsible for the lack of Latin American and other cultural representations of Catholicism in heavenly bodies? So in my research, I decided that there are four possible explanations for the lack of non-Eurocentric representation in this exhibit. First, this lack may just be attributed to a lack of non-European designers. I mean, another possibility to consider is that maybe there are indeed non-European designers. However, many of these designers may lack designs influenced by this so-called Catholic imagination. And thus, the curators did not have a variety of non-Eurocentric garments to pull from for the exhibit. Regardless of the existence of non-European designers, however, a third explanation may be that there is simply a lack of non-Eurocentric designs from both European and non-European designers influenced due to Eurocentricity in a post-colonial world. And I would also like to bring up that the fourth possible reason as to why the exhibit lacked any kind of non-European representation was maybe just in the curation of the exhibit. So perhaps this lack of non-Eurocentric designs is due to the inherent Eurocentricity of the curators. And thus those in charge of choosing the exhibit, the gowns in the exhibit, chose either intentionally or unintentionally to showcase designs from European designers. So the answer may lie in a combination of all four possibilities. However, I personally believe that the lack of non-Eurocentric representation is most likely due to curatorial choices and the limited presence of non-European, non-Anglo-American designers in haute couture. And the position of the garment in the Heavenly Bodies exhibit, as you can see from the slides here, suggests a Eurocentric perspective behind the included garments, and thus the inherent power of curation in presenting narratives. This gown is not placed directly near any paintings or any walls, and it was in the center of a room labeled Celestial Hierarchy. Since the gown is juxtaposed with only other gowns, it may at first appear that the positioning of the gown is insignificant to the meaning of the garment. However, this lack of juxtaposition reveals the Eurocentricity of the curation of the exhibit. Christian Lacroix's apparition dress presents an apparent connection to Our Lady of Guadalupe and her mandorla. Those familiar with Mexican Catholic iconography are sure to draw this connection between the garment and the familiar, repetitive image of Guadalupe and her tilma. Thus, begging the question, why would the Met have chosen to leave the gown without any art juxtaposition when there's a vast collections of paintings out there in the world of Guadalupe that might aid in the viewer's understanding of the gown and how it connects to Catholicism? And the only reasonable answer to that question for me when I was doing my research was maybe that they couldn't get a hold of a painting, or they only wanted to use paintings in their collection and they just didn't have any of Our Lady of Guadalupe. However, the curator of this exhibit, Andrew Bolton himself, speaks a little on Marian Apparitions in the introduction to the catalog of the exhibit. And he actually attempts to address the colonial past of Catholicism, however, kind of feebly, as you can tell from the quote. But in this, in addition to this attempt, he actually includes a figure of a painting that was done by a Mexican artist titled The Virgin of Guadalupe. And I have the painting right here. And this painting, of course, bears the accustomed depiction of Guadalupe. And in the citation for this figure, Bolton actually mentioned that this painting by Enriquez is in fact owned by the Met Museum. So thus, at this point in my research, it became unclear to me as to why the curators for this exhibit did not juxtapose the gown with this readily available painting, at the very least in the Heavenly Bodies catalog. As for other dresses, they placed pictures of statues or paintings that they thought the dress was kind of evocative of. But in the catalog with the dress that I chose, there was nothing on the other page. And so while it may be impossible to determine the intentions of the curators, this lack of juxtaposition and isolation of the gown in the exhibit mirrors the lack of non-Eurocentric narratives found within Heavenly Bodies and reveals the power of the curators to either intentionally or unintentionally, prevent the viewers of the exhibit from learning and understanding non-Eurocentric cultural representations of Catholicism that stem from colonial influence. Furthermore, this absence of non-Eurocentric perspectives in Heavenly Bodies may also be due to the absence of non-European designers in haute couture fashion houses, while designers such as Oscar de la Renta, Carolina Herrera, Isabel Toledo, and Carlos Miel, among others, may have made a name for themselves in the fashion industry, there does not seem to be any Catholic-inspired fashions from these designers. These designers have never admitted to basing their fashions off Catholicism. However, these designers are also Catholic, and throughout the course, many of my peers actually raised the criticism that their chosen gowns should not have been included in the exhibit at all. In other words, there were many gowns in the exhibit with only a very loose tie to Catholicism, for example, like the designer being Catholic, if there was even a tie at all. And thus, I believe that raises another question as to why the designers, like some of the few that I mentioned above that are non-European, were not included in this exhibit. However, there are actually haute couture gowns that were made by non-European designers and present a non-European depiction of the Catholic imagination that I found when I was doing my research. So the dress in the middle here actually sparks a lot of local and global controversy, and the violent image that used to be on the dress was kind of toned down for the pageant because Miss Mexico 2006 wore this for the Miss Universe pageant in 2007. The imagery was actually toned down, and the Mexican designer was forced to exchange the image of a man facing a firing squad with an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe and the women who were involved in the Cristero War, because this dress was meant to depict La Cristiada, which is also known as the Cristero Wars. Catholic-inspired garments from various Filipino designers could have also secured a place from the exhibit. After the 2018 Met Gala theme was announced, Philstar Global released an article titled Hot and Holy. Hold on, I'm sorry if you can, my computer is doing something weird. Okay, we're all good now. But I apologize, technical difficulties. Okay, great. So yes, as I was saying, after the 2018 Met Gala theme was announced, Philstar Global, which is a Filipino news media source, released an article titled Hot and Holy, 6 Filipino Designers on Fashion and the Catholic Imagination, that describes the work of 6 designers and how their Filipino Catholic childhood and personal background has influenced their designs. I have on the slide here 2 of those 6 designs mentioned in the article. Micheline Sejuco, I apologize if I butchered the name, Crusades-inspired armor dress that was actually shown at 2016 Paris Design Week, and Esme Palaganas, Babeng Luska, which is a Filipino celebration to end the mourning of death, inspired fashion show. So then it kind of became apparent that the only possible justification on behalf of the Heavenly Bodies League curators as to why they excluded garments, such as the ones mentioned on this slide, is the lack of maybe a renowned popular fashion house behind the non-European designer's name. However, it is important to consider that this justification itself is resultant of the inherent Eurocentricity existing within post-colonial society, as colonized populations and minorities have been historically given far fewer opportunities to succeed, especially in haute couture. So furthermore, the curators at the Met Museum could have utilized their platform and the Heavenly Bodies exhibit to provide a space for these non-European designers to showcase their designs, thus helping them gain representation in the fashion industry while educating their viewers on how Catholicism's colonial past led to the creation of diverse cultural renditions of the religion. However, as you've seen in my presentation, that simply did not happen. So why does any of this matter? I mean, I just talked to you for like 15 minutes about dresses, and I'm sure at this point you're kind of wondering, like, okay, they're just dresses, it's just an exhibit. But fashion is just one means of sharing narratives. In a vibrant, diverse post-colonial society, it is imperative that the shared narratives reflect the vibrancy and diversity of the population. The Met Museum's 2018 Heavenly Bodies exhibit failed to reflect upon this vibrancy and diversity of Catholic cultures that emerged from the colonial impact of Catholicism on the developing world. Eurocentricity in the curation of the garments, as well as an underrepresentation in non-European designers in the exhibit, portrayed a singular Eurocentric narrative to Heavenly Bodies attendees, despite the varied multiplicity of faces that make up Catholicism today. Representation functions as the only means to achieving and understanding a cohesive, comprehensive global narrative. Tearing down singular subjective narratives that inundate haute couture and the world beyond is the first step towards breaking down the legacy of colonialism and building an intersectional future. So yes, thank you. That was my research. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.
Thank you so much, Sophia. That was a really fabulous overview and critique of the exhibit. And I have to say that I'm so grateful for critical viewers like you for reminding all of us as we go through the world that everything we encounter has a bias, particularly exhibits that come from museums, and that questioning these biases is as important a part of viewing exhibits as understanding the content itself, and that exhibits like these can often tell us as much about the institutions that host them as about the objects that are being displayed. So I really appreciate you sharing that perspective with our audience today, and I'm sure I speak for all of our viewers today that you have really impressive research to present here, and it's really needed in the museum world today. So I'd like also to introduce our conversation here and kind of contextualize how this conversation came together in the first place. The Hearst Museum right now is hosting an online exhibit called Cloth That Stretches, Weaving Community Across Time and Space. And I feel like your presentation, Sophia, really demonstrated the way that we're trying to speak about how cloth stretches, that fabric and textiles are ways that people carry culture with them, and also ways that people actively engage in cultural and individual identity formation wherever they are, and that there are ways to tie together community. And your piece really showed that in how the exhibit is doing this for viewers, and how clothing does this, you know, in haute couture, but also in a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to link to the exhibit in our chat here if anyone wants to explore it later. The pieces that Sophia showed are not a part of this exhibit, but can be explored online as well through the Hearst Museum website. So I'd like to start off our conversation again by actually with a question for you, Maureen, Professor Miller. I'd love to hear more about what sparked the idea for this class that ultimately led to the research that Sophia produced.
Thank you. Yes. Well, and thank you for the exhibit. Thank you to Sophia for reminding me how much fun this seminar was. The seminar actually came directly out of the Heavenly Bodies exhibit, in the sense that when the exhibit was mounted, it was actually staged within the medieval collections of the Met. So both at the Met Fifth Avenue, in its ground floor area, largely devoted to medieval European art, and also up at the Cloisters, a museum entirely dedicated to medieval art. And this definitely got the attention of medievalists. All of a sudden, haute couture in the medieval galleries. And some of the first responses were that these dresses were in the way of and obscuring, you know, the views of everybody's favorite medieval pieces. But most medievalists responded with out of sort of intrigue as to what sort of juxtapositions or what sort of meanings could be created by putting these modern high fashion objects in relationship to elements in the medieval collection. So the leading scholarly organization for the study of the Middle Ages, the Medieval Academy of America, organized a panel discussion about the exhibit at its spring 2019 meetings. And because I'd published some scholarship on particularly clerical clothing during the Middle Ages, I was asked to participate in this panel discussion along with 5 other illustrious colleagues from the various disciplines that make up medieval studies. And what happened at the session is really what sparked the seminar. So first of all, the panel attracted a standing room only crowd. And that sort of blew most of us away. And interestingly, every single one of us who were asked to comment were highly critical of the exhibit, but in entirely different ways. So it generated, the exhibit itself generated a lot of different responses, all of which were interesting. And if there was a consensus that came out of both the Q&A and the presentations, was that the garments themselves were gorgeous and fascinating. But the exhibit and the whole conceptualization of it, the juxtapositions, the catalog, was a lot of missed opportunities. And so there came a point in the discussion where it's like, okay, what do you do with this thing that didn't turn out so well? And I thought immediately that this was an opportunity for collaborative research and thinking through these issues. And so I proposed to the freshman sophomore seminar program directed by Alex Schwartz to do, a seminar based on this. And indeed, Berkeley students had a lot more of interest to say about these garments and the exhibit than anything in the catalog. And, exactly the conceit of the exhibit. So that's basically what led to the seminar, which I'm actually offering again this spring.
A great plug for any students in our audience today. Thank you for that overview. That's really helpful. And I think further demonstrates the importance of dialogue around exhibits like these for filling in the gaps. Obviously, not every exhibit is going to have a limited amount to say, but that there's so much productive work that can be done in between what wasn't shown and what these missed opportunities speak to that weren't shown. So Sofia, what were some of the highlights for you, either from the class or from your research, that have stuck with you since that time?
Yeah, so actually each class we had kind of a sort of discussion for maybe a half an hour to an hour among everyone else that was in the seminar, and Professor Miller made each of us participate. So she made it so that way each of us had to speak at least once. And at first that sounded kind of like, oh man, what is this professor trying to get us to do? Forcing us to speak even if we don't want to. But I found that was actually a really productive way for getting tons of different unique inputs to our conversation, because it really even if you didn't have anything to say, it forced you to have to think of something to say. And I found that everyone that was in the seminar had really interesting things to contribute to the discussion, and definitely all the different unique inputs and ideas that came from everyone's different backgrounds, I think really led to a lot of really fascinating critiques of the exhibit. I also think that the course is really interesting in that it kind of forced not just me, but the rest of us in the seminar to think really critically about something I don't think any of us really thought we would ever have to think critically about, which is haute couture and a museum exhibit and religious interpretation and what kind of this whole Catholic imagination really is. And so I found that in our discussions, there was a lot of really provocative ideas that were being raised. And that not only that, but when I was actually doing the research, it was also incredibly rewarding, because I remember I was sitting outside of a library once, trying to get some research done. And I was watching a video that was in French because there wasn't that much on Christian Lacroix, because he's a designer and not some sort of historical person really. And it was just really rewarding at the end of the day to know that even something as that seems kind of ridiculous, watching a whole hour-long video in French, really contributed to my understanding of the exhibit and of the garment. And doing the research overall was really rewarding, because at the end of the semester, you kind of get to see this final product that you've been working on this whole time. And so that was a unique experience. I was really glad I had an opportunity to take part in.
That's great. I'm so grateful for all the opportunities that exist at Berkeley for this student-led research, because it's such a good opportunity, not only for producing new research, but for all these unexpected learning experiences that you have along the way. Probably, I'm sure you collected tons of other information beyond what ended up in your final research that has probably stuck with you. So this question is for both of you. And actually, before I ask it, I want to remind, I'm going to open up the chat to our audience. So you should be able to chat publicly now. I'll be posing some of your questions to our speakers today, but feel free to drop questions as you have them in the chat and I'll hold them till the end. So this is for both of you. Can you tell me about some surprises that came out of this course, things you didn't expect to discover or discuss that became kind of important?
Sure. So I was really, I wouldn't say I wasn't surprised that Berkeley students had fantastic things to say about this, but I was surprised at how critical in a productive way the students were. And that was really exciting and uplifting for me. So just to give one example, you know, one of the first assignments was to actually look into the background of the designer and figure out, like, what is this person's relationship maybe with Catholicism that got them perhaps included in this exhibit. And I was really impressed with the way that, first of all, the kind of research that, detailed research that everyone did, but how strongly students felt about designers, for example, who had utterly no relationship with Catholicism. And in fact, if you looked at the way that the dress had been presented in the collection, clearly it had nothing to do with Catholicism, being recontextualized and made to mean, supposedly in the context of exhibits, certain things. And that led to really interesting and productive discussions about curatorial ethics, for example, or what's appropriation and what's not. So that's what I mean by sort of productive critique of being able to point out something that's problematic and then tussle with it in a way that actually sheds light on larger issues.
Yeah, so for me, I really had no expectations coming into the course. Like, frankly, I just enrolled in it because it fulfilled a requirement and I watch a lot of Project Runway. Um, but I ended up learning not only a lot about fashion and Catholicism, which was, like, I guess a little unexpected because like I said, I had no expectations for the course. But I also learned a lot about museum curation and the inherent power in shaping narratives, which is kind of what my professor was just speaking about. And I thought that a lot of the critiques my peers raised were also extremely insightful. So the examples I pulled up beforehand were actually the same ones Professor Miller just referenced. So for example, whether or not like something should have been included in the exhibit, or whether or not the exhibit was culturally appropriating Catholicism, and all these kinds of questions that this kind of like approach raised towards haute couture and towards fashion and museum curation. I definitely think that like all of the insights my peers brought up were very interesting because it was like looking at the exhibit in a way that some people, you know, critiques of the exhibit, some were very positive towards the exhibit, some were saying, oh, this exhibit is like helping like reinvigorate Catholicism and also like kind of shape it in like a modern framework and bringing in fashion and these beautiful garments that celebrate their religion. And other people kind of see it as blasphemous. And so I think just like looking at an exhibit in this way was something that I didn't expect when I enrolled in the course.
Yeah, and I love that this exhibit was given the same critical attention that, you know, works of art on an individual basis or pieces of literature are often given in a course, and that, you know, exhibits themselves are these kind of works with authorship that sometimes are veiled in ways that a piece of writing or a piece of art isn't. Like we don't often look at what is the cultural background or, you know, academic background of a curator when we visit a museum exhibit, and that's as important to understand the framework of the exhibit. So I'm just really, I hope people do this to exhibits at the Hearst Museum. Like, I think this is the greatest honor that can be bestowed upon an exhibit is a really critical view of it that sparks more conversation and more findings than could have existed within the exhibit itself. So we're getting some really fabulous questions here in from our audience that I'd like to draw our attention to, some privately and some publicly. The one that came in first was one of our audience members asking, what immediately struck me is the models live and in display are white, unnaturally white. My memory of the apparition was it had such meaning as she appeared to native Juan Diego to speak natively, and she appeared not as white, but as one of them. She had brown skin in the apparition, at least according to this person's memory. Any thoughts or findings about the use of white mannequins in the exhibit and white models on the part of the designers and their representation? Or did this come up for discussion in the class?
I actually have given this question a little bit of thought as well. I couldn't really incorporate it into my research because I only had like so many pages, but in terms of the white models, I'm actually not entirely sure if Christian Lacroix intended for his dress to be evocative of Guadalupe itself, or whether it was just some sort of Virgin Mary evocation. And if you start to think of that way, then you could also beg the question whether this dress of Guadalupe is almost culturally appropriating like Mexican Catholic culture. And if that's the case, if he just never intended for it to really be Guadalupe and he's putting it on white models, and I think that's another criticism that you can look at. But if you look at it with he's only using white models, but he did intend for it to be Guadalupe, then I think you're kind of raising the question of maybe he's kind of whitewashing the experiences and whitewashing this kind of religious history. And I'm not really sure what the answer is to that. I'm not Christian Lacroix, and he never like came forward with any statements regarding this dress. But that's definitely something that I think is worth like thinking about, and like maybe someday we'll get our answer, but I don't know. And then in terms of the white mannequins, I think that just kind of goes along with the rest of my other critiques, because if you look at the exhibit as itself being inherently Eurocentric, then the curation itself, they're not really going to see a problem with having white mannequins, because they might just say, oh, if all the mannequins are white, then it's all like equal, it's all the same, right? Because to them, they're not even really thinking about what the importance or what the kind of effect having maybe like a brown model or having like a flesh tone model would have on a viewer, right? Because in their eyes, they're only thinking about the singular narrative that they just have inherently biased themselves towards. And so these are questions I don't really know if we can answer right now. I feel like we can have opinions on them, but I think that it's kind of hard to devise a direct answer without hearing it straight from the curator's mouth. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say in response to that question. I don't know if my professor has anything else to add.
Yeah, I would just add it's a great question about all the certainly the choices that go into curation. And I would say that, you know, it was actually the whole exhibit was put together at a time when there'd already been debate within haute couture and, you know, New York Fashion Week about the scarcity of models of color. And since that issue had already come up about you know, the presentation of fashion, you know, it seems, again, like a little bit tone deaf on the part of the curators of the Met not to think through that. I mean, since it was an ongoing critique. I mean, a parallel sort of thing, which I ended up talking about at the Medieval Academy panel, was that, you know, that one of the big elephants in the room, you know, what's obviously, if you looked at the newspapers about Catholic imaginations when the exhibit went up, it was all about the sexual abuse scandal within the Catholic Church. And some of the presentations of outfits and the verbiage that went along with them was really insensitive to that kind of background and problematic when viewed in light of it. So, you know, it just points out, I think the questioner raised a really great issue about all the decisions that go into curation, and that just taking an aesthetic approach, I mean, even if you attribute it to an aesthetic approach, it would be, you know, it reveals an assumption that models are white, you know, because the mannequins are all white. Anyways, great question, and definitely food for thought.
And I think that's actually a perfect transition into another question that came in about whether Andrew Bolton was approached at any point during this course or after this course with some of the findings and critiques from the students with some of these research questions.
You know, there is actually a special issue of the history department's undergraduate history journal, Clio Scroll, which came out, and I did send copies to the Met. I didn't get any response. There were actually two, they weren't curators directly involved in the exhibit who, it turns out, were at the round table, and we didn't find out until like the Q&A, and then we felt a little bit embarrassed that we'd ripped the exhibit to shreds while folks from the Met were there. But you know, they understood, at least those representatives of the Met sort of understood and appreciated at least the taking seriously the art of the exhibit.
Yeah, and I hope that those folks that were associated with the Met, you know, took the serious criticism of this as a compliment. And, you know, I think all a curator can hope when presenting an exhibit is that it sparks real curiosity, that the exhibit is the start of one's research and understanding and not the end, that the exhibit is not the final word, it's the first word or one of the words in the middle. So another question from our audience here is for Sofia, whether in your research you consider the economic forces that drove some of the choices where the fashion industry with its big names, many with New York connections, dominated, and that may have had some part in the curation. I rephrased the question slightly. Thank you to our viewer for your understanding.
I never actually looked at the specifics in terms of the economics, but I think I was kind of hinting at that with my whole like Eurocentric, post-colonial kind of society parts of my research, just because when we do live in a post-colonial society, you have to look at which groups in our society are given more opportunities to succeed economically, and which groups are given opportunities to be parts of haute couture fashion houses. And you also have to think about inherent biases that are present within our society, right? So let's say a fashion show decides they want to just use only like Mexican American models in their show, right? That might spark some criticism. It also might not be taken in as well from people with the big bucks in these companies, right? And so I think it's hard to kind of separate the economics from this issue, just because like kind of money runs the world. And I think something, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, but something we did, I think, discuss a little bit in our class was also just like the amount of revenue the Met Museum gets from exhibits like these, and from things like the Met Gala, where tons of celebrities show up in these like ridiculously expensive garments and they receive a ton of media attention. And I think that those are things definitely to consider. I unfortunately have not looked into the specifics regarding like the actual numbers, but that's probably what I would say for that question.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have a comment here about, some more folks kind of responding to their perspectives. Thank you for sharing that. So we have another question that I think can be for both of you. It's a two-parter. The first was whether you can speak in a little more detail to what you saw as some of those missed opportunities that the exhibit had, which I think you spoke to a little bit already, but anything that you might not have mentioned. And that the second part of the question is one point, Sofia, that you raised is a very important argument. The colonial impact of the Catholic imagination on designers and narratives told through clothes in Mexico is, sorry, I'm just rereading this question. So yes, so the colonial impact of the Catholic imagination has had a big influence on designers and narratives in Mexico. And could both of you address that in more detail? So missed opportunities, and then specifically to some of the designers that you mentioned and their influence.
Well, in terms of missed opportunities, one of the things that came out at the panel and really struck me in looking at the exhibit again is that there were all of these opportunities to actually generate meaning through juxtaposition. And they were just, in many ways, they were missed because they kept going for aesthetic juxtapositions, much more than ones that might actually raise questions about meaning. I mean, one of the interesting things and really politically odd things about, even controversial about the exhibit is that Bolton, the curator, made a big deal of having a special relationship with the Vatican. And there was a whole group of artifacts, priestly vestments, and a whole lot of very blinged out tiaras and rings and jewels. And this material from the Vatican actually could have been very interestingly juxtaposed with the haute couture, but to get the things that Met clearly entered into some agreement with the Vatican that this Vatican stuff would be segregated. And it was in its own gallery space, not, juxtaposed with anything. And in fact, they took the segregation so far that there are 2 volumes to the exhibit catalog, so that the Vatican artifacts could not be even in print intermingled with this haute couture fashions. So again, there were lots of curatorial possibilities that I think were missed in the exhibit.
Yeah, also speaking on the missed opportunities a little bit more, I feel like for me, right, when we were discussing things like curation and juxtaposition and how that can lead towards, what the viewer of the exhibit kind of walks away from when they leave the exhibit, right? For me, it was like this exhibit was very tailored towards Eurocentric perspectives. And so a really big missed opportunity for me is what happens when like a Mexican American woman goes into this exhibit and they see they're a very devoutly Catholic woman, they've been raised with the faith all their life. They go in and they don't really see any gowns or anything that reflects their own upbringing, their own interpretation of the faith, their own, understanding of what Catholicism is to them. And so I do feel like a big missed opportunity here that I kind of hinted at in my paper as well, with like, they could have maybe uplifted more like diverse voices, given them a chance, because haute couture is very exclusive. Beyond that, I think just also giving a more diverse kind of understanding to the exhibit for its viewers, and considering like the different perspectives of people who might be going into the exhibit, I think that could have been a lot more meaningful in the exhibit, and it could have made it a lot more provocative for more types of people rather than just the singular narrative.
Yeah, I totally agree with Sophia. I think that's a really good point that, it's, and that was the problem. They took this concept of the Catholic imagination out of a very antiquated sociologist's work, Andrew Greeley's writings. And in the scholarly literature on Catholicism, there's a lot more recent concepts that might have made for a much more interesting exhibit. But having chosen Catholic imagination to actually think a bit more broadly and think about the global reach of Catholicism, and the implications of that. Yeah, great point, Sophia. Real missed opportunity there.
So one more question from our audience that I wanted to make sure I got to was, and I think you might have mentioned this just a moment ago, but was there any male gendered clothing in the show, considering that priests are male?
Yes. I spent a lot of time studying. They had a whole phalanx of outfits that were either inspired in some ways by the attire of Catholic priests, like what you might call streetwear rather than liturgical vestments. And some of those there were like some male overcoats in black, male sorts of scarves that looked like stoles and things like that. But it was predominantly articles of clothing for women, even the ones that were actually appropriating and playing with male priestly garb. And that was one of the, we had several interesting discussions about that. What does it mean? There was one dress that what did we end up calling it, like the Mad Pope dress or something, because it was this elaborate, actually sort of Episcopal looking with a mitre and everything. And in one way, the mannequin was sort of gender ambiguous, but it was definitely a dress. So it was like putting what does it mean to appropriate to females some of the power of these ecclesiastical offices. One of the students, Cora Downey, worked on this beautiful Balenciaga coat that is clearly designed or inspired by cardinal attire, and she had a lot of fun playing with that as well.
Yeah, I actually one thing to add, I think the garment that you're discussing, wasn't it a part of like a collection that was titled like Freaks and Fetishes or something like that, like something relating to fetish? Is that the same garment that you're thinking of?
Well, it wasn't. You're right. It was next to the a part of the exhibit that did go into those fetishes that we looked at, like the very goth-looking rosaries and skulls and things like that.
Yeah, so that raises questions in itself. Another thing I remember, I don't know if any of you guys remember this because it was a big kind of controversy, but Rihanna for the Met Gala dressed up as like a sexy pope, with like a little short dress that showed some cleavage and had a big bedazzled papal hat. And I think that's also something that we discussed in the course as well. Just kind of the controversy surrounding that gown, and whether it was kind of disrespectful. So.
The final question I wanted to ask you both was kind of a more general one, and I love going into the detail of all of these particular garments. And I've just shared in the chat here the archived issue of this special issue of Cleo's Scroll featuring the work by undergraduates is available online. I'll share it with everyone after the talk as well, but it's here in the chat if you want to click on it. But the last question, since we just have a few minutes left, that I wanted to ask you both was, what would you say were the key lessons learned or takeaways from this course? How did it change your perspective after this course in thinking about things moving forward?
Well, I'd say that first of all, my chief takeaway is I need to offer more undergraduate seminars because they're so much fun. But I guess the key thing I would take away, and I feel like was really inspiring through the course, is that oftentimes in aspects of contemporary culture that we find problematic or disturbing are really good starting points for collaborative research. In some ways, it's one of the best sort of uses, I think, of scholarship to take something that is problematic, or you could say bad, and turn it into actually something good by bringing different perspectives to bear on the subject matter.
Yeah, I would definitely say for me, kind of along a similar note, is that there's always a way to look deeper into something, and that something as simple as fashion or as simple as like the Met Gala or something that sounds kind of ridiculous and shallow can actually be made into something very thought provocative and very like kind of significant to our understanding of modern culture, our understanding of how society is, and what kind of narratives make up our society. And so I thought that was something interesting that like I never expected we would spend a full semester long just talking about like haute couture and Catholicism. It doesn't sound like there's that much to the topic, but there's so much. We didn't even get into probably like half of it, I think, within our time in the course. So.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for giving us a little glimpse into the findings from this course and to your research, Sofia. It's been a really fascinating topic of conversation, and it looks like we had some really engaged and informed audience members here who are also contributing great things to the chat, which I really appreciate. So thank you to everyone for being here tonight. We only have a couple minutes left, so if you want to send in your final questions, I can pose them to our speakers kind of after the fact. And thank you all for being here this evening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
I also want to take a moment to thank the Hearst Museum for hosting this event, to our assistant Sam Kurtz, who's on the call today helping out with tech, and also to the Department of History and other departments at UC Berkeley that helped in co-promotion of this event, Berkeley Arts and Design, and the Arts Research Center. And thank you to our audience members for being here today.